Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. So here's the question. Is the solution to live with more awe? The solution maybe to our societal problems, challenges, the solution to our personal challenges. Well, maybe your reaction to that might be, what's wrong? People give a million diverse and contrary opinions about what's wrong. But one thing that all of the commentators seem to have consensus on is that they all think that something is wrong. What are some of them, just to scratch the surface? Fracturing social groups, the disappearance of spaces and endeavors for people to be together and share of themselves, the credibility of institutions, a heightened concern only for the self as opposed to giving of the self for the needs of others around us, throwaway culture, oceans filled with garbage, the vast inefficiency of creating one-use items just because it's profitable, and maybe a layer deeper than that, the question of why one-use throwaway things are more profitable than the exercise of craft that expresses the self. Of course, on the list are prejudice, isolation, what has been called by many an epidemic of isolation. And perhaps those things are related as we move from the bubbles of our home to the bubbles of our cars to the bubbles of our work. Also on the list, the economic press towards monolithic sameness and efficiency. You have your own thoughts. Everybody does. This isn't meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to whet the appetite. But the other confusing thing about many items on the lists that we could make is whether they're the symptoms or whether they're the cause. Because we all know if you just treat the symptoms, but you do nothing with the source, then there will always be continuous symptoms of the uncured hurt at their center. Even if you're able to, in some sense, cure a symptom, a new one emerges. Even if there's unanimity that something is amiss, there are, again, many diverse opinions as to the cause. And that brings us back to the question today, which we can ask even if we're not going to form consensus as to cause. What if the solution is to live with more awe? Consider these attributes of a life lived with awe and see how they match to your own list of ills. Awe is an antidote to pride at the source of many wrongs and inequities. Why is awe an antidote? Because it reveals our own humbleness before things that we can see are greater than us. It reveals our vulnerability. And once you have those things, then you are capable of empathy. That is, forming real communion with your neighbors because you have a shared point from which to understand one another. Maybe you share enough that you are willing to learn more about one another. Awe gets us out of the lonely hole of the artificial. Whatever our problems might be, we have to face them. We can't live in distraction. Time spent alone in the virtual world, sometimes hiding, sometimes luxuriating, sometimes medicating, whatever the reason, keeps us away from authentic relationship that tells us something about who we are, who others are, what we're about in this life, and where we come from. I say it's a lonely hole because we can be trapped there alone, just enthralled with the lowest forms of pleasure, but also because it can be a place of monolithic opinion where nothing great is asked of us. So no challenge is ever taken, no virtue is ever exercised. Here's some more things to say for awe. It gives us a focus on what endures, as opposed to what is passing and disposable. The things that cause us to feel awe are often those that will endure, those that have endured, those that are worthy of endurance. And why? Because they convey some truth about our shared human endeavor. Awe also allows us to live with beauty. Living with beauty is always good, because if you've listened to any of our other episodes, you know it's the philosophy of this podcast that things are beautiful because they convey something that is true. And so living in beauty, having greater access to the truth, raises us up. Not to mention that two people can walk down the same street, one in amazement and one collapsed in on themselves. And imagine the difference in their psychology, in their openness, in their willingness to exercise virtue inspired by what is around them. Awe allows us to see the talents and the triumphs of others. This is maybe the flip side of the point earlier about pride, in having us think less of ourselves and more of what's around us. But think of what it would mean if that happened at some scale. When we live in awe, then we have the joy of sharing it with the young. Children, of course, present challenges and sacrifices. But living with awe, you may experience the great excitement of sharing all of the things that amaze you with this new life, so they can also savor it and have joy. It even might make you feel that great sense of amazement all over again. Sometimes children come into the picture after you've seen so much that you start to become cynical. And then you start spending your time with someone for whom it is miraculous that water is wet, that animals move, that color is real, that you can go to intriguing and different places, that all music is new. And suddenly, it's like you're living all these things for the first time again yourself, seeing all the incredible things that you have forgot to notice for a long time. What else? Awe reveals the false metrics of materialism. No one really cares about the metrics of possession and ownership except the people who are trying to sell it. And anyone who's been down that hole necessarily finds that it is not an answer. Living in awe is counterbalance to the gravity of these false metrics, because it keeps our eyes focused on something greater. Awe encourages us to go outside, which means that we can come to love our shared world, and it means that we can care for our shared world. Awe shatters the illusion that we know everything, because we're constantly in contact with great mysteries, with the unsolvable, with the striving of generations, centuries, and millennia of great minds and hungry hearts. Think of the problems that might be solved if each side realized that the other had some of what they needed to know. Even when one has the truth, for example, the truth of Christ, it's an error to think that that can simply be given away the way you would give someone a package. Sharing truth is a matter of trust and relationship involves mutual giving. Awe demonstrates that human beings are not commodities. That happens by being in awe of the human person itself, but also the experience of being a human person situated in this place of awe that surrounds us. There are probably other ways, too. Think of what it would do to the world if each human being was a sister or a brother and not a product for temporary use. Awe can transform even our work when we can make our work an actualization of our own human identity, when we can be amazed at what it means to create, to have effect, to add to our shared endeavor. Does that mean every job is a good one? No. Does it mean every day at the job is a good one? No. But it can mean that work is not a curse, but in its own way, a gift. Now, in a dose of pragmatism, we have to admit that none of this is flipping a switch. Suddenly having awe does not suddenly raise someone out of poverty, but it can change the conditions that lead to poverty. It can change the way we think about charity. It can change what we buy, where we go. It can change the perspective of possibility, even in unjustly limited circumstances. And because awe leads us to ponder, to contemplate, to search, we need teams to search well. That leads to community, and community is a bulwark against isolated helplessness. And I'll also add that awe naturally points us toward the heart of mystery, to the source of being. It is a pathway to the highest engagement of the person to contemplate God and life itself. And in contemplating God, God increases our awe, so that the interaction of the two continually raises our minds and our hearts higher. So finally, if more awe can change things, how do we affect the change of increasing awe? Yes, we can teach art, we can teach science, we can take the young to engage with it, but they have to listen. And some of these things can be a proxy for status and not an authentic experience. The only real way is for us to be in awe ourselves, for each of us personally to live with it and to share it in relationship with those around us, to open ourselves up to beauty and to take someone with us. Awe is the threshold of faith. That is, it gives us a reason to trust. And as St. Peter says, always be ready to share the reason for your hope. So also, and maybe one in the same, always have ready our awe.